The missing persons cases that really stay with me are the type where, in the middle of a seemingly normal day, someone vanishes into thin air. This is definitely that type of case. How could a woman disappear in the middle of a busy day, in the middle of a town where she was very well known, and never be seen again? The definition of vanishing is to disappear suddenly and completely. That is exactly what happened in this case. Let's talk about the vanishing of Trevaline Evans. Trevaline Evans was a well-thought-of 52-year-old woman who lived in the tourist town of Llangollen, Wales, in Great Britain. She had a husband, Richard, a son, Richard, as well as two grandchildren whom she doted on. She had lived in Llangollen her entire life, and the year prior had fulfilled a dream of hers. She had purchased her own antique store called Attic Antiques on Church Street in her hometown. The middle of June had gone by as usual for Trevaline Evans and her husband Richard. They had spent the week prior at their vacation home near the coast of Ridland where they were doing some renovations. Trevaline had returned to Llangollen on Wednesday, June 13th, while her husband stayed behind to continue some work on the couple's bungalow. June 16, 1990 would start off as a typical Saturday for Trevaline Evans. She had opened Attic Antiques at 9:30 a.m. She had already had a busy morning with no fewer than 25 friends and customers entering the store. By all accounts, Trevaline was her usual self and seemed to be relaxed and in good spirits. She had even made plans to go out that night. Unfortunately, by the end of that day, everything would change. At about 12:40 p.m., Trevaline put a sign in her shop door saying, "Back in 2 minutes." It was something Trevaline often did. She would leave a note saying how long she would be gone and lock up the store. It is thought she was leaving to go get lunch. 20 minutes later, she was seen buying an apple and banana on High Street and was seen crossing Castle Street. There was what was said to be a confirmed sighting of her near her home on Market Street at 2:30 p.m. There were two other suspected sightings of a woman matching Trevaline's description. At 2:35 p.m. walking out of town and at 3:45 p.m. walking from Park Avenue towards the Dee River. After that, it appears Trevaline Evans vanished into thin air. Hours would go by and no one seemed to really know that Trevaline was missing. It was noticed the back in 2 minutes sign would remain on her door for the rest of the day. People would purchase the items she had out on the sidewalk in boxes and drop the money inside the door slot. On Saturday, late afternoon and night, Trevaline's husband tried to phone her several times with no answer. This concerned him enough to ask a neighbor to go to the house and then her store to check on his wife. When the neighbor told Richard Evans about the sign, the door locked, her purse inside, and her car still at the shop, he knew something was wrong. Richard Evans phoned the police and told them his wife was missing. The police started investigating right away. At the time, it was the largest missing persons search in Welsh history. Every single household in Llangollen was interviewed, more than 1,500 names checked, and 700 cars eliminated. Police took 330 statements. There were searches made in the River Dee, canals, mine shafts, and caves. Absolutely no trace of Trevaline Evans could be found. Now we're going to talk about the actions of Trevaline Evans in the few days before her disappearance. Once again, these are solely based on witness accounts. Some of these people knew Trevaline and some did not, saying it was someone matching her description. Given the fact that Trevaline Evans owned an antique shop and was always open to buying treasures from people, that would possibly explain why she was seen with the few unknown men. Trevaline was reported to have a sign hanging in her shop that said, "I'll buy anything." She was seen on June 14th, 2 days before her disappearance, with a smartly dressed man with gray hair in her shop. The next day, he was seen again walking with Trevaline, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. There were also reports of Trevaline talking to a dark-haired man outside her shop 2 days before her disappearance. A couple that knew Trevaline said they noticed her Friday night, the day before her disappearance, in the doorway of a cafe on Castle Street. They said she had paperwork in her hand and kept looking down the street as if she were waiting for someone. A shopkeeper said that Trevaline entered her shop at 10 a.m. Saturday morning to buy some milk. She did notice that Trevaline had a large wad of money clearly visible in her purse. However, when her purse was later found at her shop, apparently the wad of money was not inside. As is often the case, Trevaline's husband Richard was closely looked at. He was even briefly arrested years later, but then soon after released without being charged. It was said he was about 50 miles away at the vacation home when his wife went missing. There were witnesses who put him at that location on June 16th, and when Trevaline had returned home on June 13th, she had taken the couple's only car. I do want to mention there's been a lot of talk about Trevaline Evans possibly having a gentleman friend around the time of her disappearance. I do want to point out there's no solid evidence of this, more just a theory. When the Crime Watch UK show featured Trevaline's case in 1990, during the update episode, they said some Scottish tourists who didn't know Trevaline personally said they saw her and a gray-haired man at Gale's Wine Bar on Friday evening, the day before she disappeared. Police stated this sighting had been confirmed. Trevaline Evans' case grew cold very quickly. However, police had never forgotten about her case, and 11 years after her disappearance, in 2011, it was reopened. They assigned the case an incident room and had 10 officers going over everything. They were said to focus on the 3 days before she went missing. Unfortunately, 6 months later, the inquiry ended with no more answers. There was a serial killer who was investigated to see if there was a possible connection to Trevaline's case. His name was Robin Ligas. He had killed 3 men, one of them an antiques dealer, and they all took place in a 6-month period in 1994, only 30 miles from Trevaline's shop. However, the police could find no connection. In 2019, Trevaline Evans' case had some renewed hope. 2 brothers, Andy and Lee Sutton, went to police saying they had information that Trevaline had been murdered and her body buried under the floor of the Ridland Golf Club. Police did excavate the area but could find no remains. The brothers would then launch a formal complaint against the North Wales Police Force, saying they had ignored the information the brothers gave them on her case. There was an investigation put forth, but the brothers' claims were not substantiated. When Trevaline Evans went missing, she left behind her Ford Escort parked at her shop, purse, coat, and some flowers she was to bring home. Also, no activity since her disappearance has been made on her bank account. There was a banana skin found in her garbage, but it's impossible to know if it was the same one she purchased on the day she went missing. It is unknown and highly unlikely, given the busy street, that she returned to her shop after putting the sign on the door. The question remains, where was Trevaline Evans on the day she went missing between 1 and 2:30 p.m.? There were no sightings in that time, and to know where she was then would be crucial in piecing together what happened that day. Trevaline Evans was officially declared dead in 1997. To add another tragedy to this family, her son Richard Evans, who was a police sergeant, died suddenly in 1999 of a heart attack. He was only 37 years old. Her husband Richard passed away in 2015 at the age of 83, never remarrying after Trevaline went missing. Something happened with Trevaline Evans' case in 2021, 31 years after her disappearance, that is almost as bizarre as her vanishing itself. A plaque was found on a council bench on the Prestatyn to Dyserth walkway, 30 miles from Llangollen. The plaque was not authorized to be there and read, "In memory of Trevaline Evans, vanished 16/6/1990, found Ridland GC 14/3/2019, removed 19/3/2019, RIP." The plaque has since been removed by Denbighshire County Council, But recently another one was found at a Prestatyn hillside attached to a wooden bench at Pantyfauquin, the remains of a 200-year-old miner's cottage. This one reads, Justice awaits those responsible for the removal and disposal of Trevaline Evans, this life or next, from Ridland Golf Club on March 19, 2019 at noon. May the Lord have mercy upon their soul. That plaque has since disappeared. No one knows who has put either of these plaques on the benches. Could it be related to the Sutton brothers' info that her body was buried at the Ridland Golf Club? Could it just be a crackpot seeking attention, or could it come from the person who murdered Trevaline Evans if she did meet with foul play? I do find it interesting the person who created the plaque thinks they know the exact time that Trevaline Evans' body was removed. Then in 2023, a documentary series called In the Footsteps of Killers released an episode on Trevaline Evans, and it brought forth an interesting theory that involves someone not yet associated with this disappearance. Could Trevaline Evans have been a victim of convicted killer Christopher Hallowell? A former carpet fitter who wants to remain unnamed has come forward to state that he saw a man around the time Trevaline vanished who bore a striking resemblance to the killer. The stranger was first spotted in the small town on June 15th, the day before the disappearance. The witness said he walked along Market Street but didn't make eye contact, and states the stranger was acting very strange and was quite tall with big eyes. He then turned around and walked back down Market Street. The next morning, he saw the mystery man at Horseshoe Pass around 7:45 a.m. He had come out of a camper van that was parked there, and the witness was certain it was the same man he had seen the night before. The timeline of the third and last supposed sighting of the stranger, I think, is noteworthy regarding Trevaline Evans' disappearance. The witness claims to have seen the same camper van around 12:30 p.m. parked at the Quick Save parking lot. It is noteworthy because the Quick Save was very close to Trevaline's shop, and she would leave her store for the last time around 12:40 p.m., which is right around the sighting. I also found that Hallowell had a prior charge with stealing antiques. Is it possible that Hallowell approached Trevaline with the ruse of her looking at some antiques in his van? I'm excited to introduce my guest on this podcast to help with some theories on this mysterious disappearance. He's been a good friend and offered great support for my blog and now my podcast, and has a very popular podcast of his own called The Trail Went Cold. I'm pleased to welcome Robin Warder to my podcast today.
Great, thanks for having me. It's we've known each other for so long and spoken about so many cases that it's great that we're finally recording a podcast episode together.
Yeah, I was going to say we've been friends for years, and we met via the Unsolved Mysteries board on Sitcoms Online. So this collaboration is long overdue.
Yes, I remember being a member of that board many years before I started the podcast, and we probably had some back and forth. And I always say that if it wasn't for the board, I probably wouldn't have started The Trail Went Cold, because being there for years made me realize there's still a big interest in these unsolved mysteries cases, and people start like talking about them. So I figured, why not start a podcast and get them out into the open again?
That's true, because when I would post on there, I would be curious about these cases, and I would just do research so I could post any kind of updates if there were any. And it just kind of grew from there. Okay, so when you first heard about this case of Trevaline, what did you initially think happened?
Well, looking back, before I started the podcast, I used to write a lot of freelance articles for listverse.com. And I think in 2014 or so, I published an article about 10 people who mysteriously vanished from their workplace. And we're looking for random cases to select. That's when I learned about the Trevaline Evans case. And I would say it's probably one of the more baffling disappearances that I've seen, because it's one of those ones where someone vanishes from their workplace in broad daylight in the middle of a town, and no witnesses seem to see anything. And I just had a feeling that she probably stepped out for a bit, or she was either abducted from her store and someone subsequently murdered her and disposed of her body. But it just seemed astonishing to me that someone can get away with this without leaving any evidence behind and not having any eyewitnesses.
Yeah, the challenging part about this case, it's hard to come up with logical theories because the circumstances are so strange and this disappearance happened like in the blink of an eye.
Exactly. And from what I read about this town in Wales, it was one of those small communities where everyone knew everyone. And
Yeah.
we have a whole bunch of eyewitnesses who think that they saw Trevaline later on that day, possibly walking away from her shop and going to other locations. But all these sightings cannot be correct. I'm sure that most, if not all of them, are mistaken, and that
Yeah.
only confuses the investigation.
Yeah, there were a few verified, but I mean, she was going in all different directions at different times. It just didn't make any sense.
And also the fact that she left her car behind and she left like her purse and all of her personal items back in the store. So it really seems like she only stepped out for a very brief period of time and was not planning to go anywhere, yet some of the sightings place her a couple miles away.
Yeah, and I just finished watching the short documentary on Trevaline on YouTube on the Our Life channel, and it was from 2001, and they interviewed her brother, Lynn Davies, and he said that he had spoke to Trevaline a week prior, and she told him on the day of the disappearance, she had an appointment to view a bungalow in St. Martin, which was about 7 miles from Llangollen, but she never made it. He didn't say what time the appointment was, but I'm assuming it would be later in the day after she'd closed the shop. But I mean, first I thought, well, why was she looking at a bungalow? Because the police in this documentary actually said there was tension in her married life. And I had never heard that before either.
Yes, you read a lot of the older articles, and they make you think that her husband Richard cannot be involved, and because he was many miles away working on the house, and there didn't seem to be any noticeable issues in the marriage. But if I recall correctly, I know that they took Richard into custody and detained him in 2001, and that would have been the approximate time period of this documentary, right?
Yes, yes, and I'm curious about the law in the UK because they even use the term that he was arrested, but he was never charged.
I've
Um,
noticed that a lot with some of the UK cases that I researched where they use the term arrested to describe taking someone into custody for questioning, even if they don't charge them, because a lot of the time, I think they can only keep them for a certain amount of time, and if they elect not to charge them, they'll let them go. But for whatever reason, they use the term arrested in the media, so it sounds like that they're a suspect and that they're going to go to prison and be charged, but a lot of the time, this doesn't happen.
Maybe a little bit of a scare tactic in there too.
Exactly. Yeah. And the majority of the time, when suspects are quote unquote arrested in these cases, they do not release to the public why, what compelled them to bring this person
Yeah.
in at this particular time. And that certainly applies to Richard because we have no idea why they decided to take him into custody 11 years after the fact.
Yeah, because I believe that he was in Ridlin, which was about 30 miles away, and I heard that they even had like workmen were there working on that house. And the reason I was curious about the bungalow in St. Martin was, well, what if she was planning on leaving? But in the Crime Watch UK reenactment, they mentioned she told her friend that there was an offer on their house in Llangollen. So maybe they were getting a smaller place in St. Martin, which would have definitely been driving distance for her shop, and then they would go to Ridlin on the weekends because they referred to that as a vacation home, I believe.
Oh, that's interesting because I did some research before we recorded this, but I did not see that particular documentary. So this is the first time hearing about this
Yeah.
bungalow.
Yeah, that was the first time, and I mean, literally before we started recording, I saw it and I watched it. But yeah, so I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be a red flag. It's just, and that actually goes to a big thing for me that she didn't leave willingly because she had made a lot of short term plans as well, not just because everyone says, oh, they would have never left. Well, she made specific, you know, plans. Like the next day was Father's Day. She was very close with her elderly father, and she had, you know, I believe a party and a week to go to and just all kinds of plans that she had made.
And also, even if she was having problems with her husband, she still had a son and a couple of
Yes.
grandkids at this point. So I'm thinking that even if she wanted to end her marriage, I don't think she would cut off all contact with her son and her grandchildren.
Yes, yes. And So, what do you make of the strange man or men, but there's more specifically one they talk about that she was seen with?
Yes, I know that they said that she was seen with this man the day before she went missing, and this would have been the time period when her husband was away. So that has caused speculation that maybe she was having an extramarital affair. Another possible explanation is that this could have been someone that she was arranging to sell antiques to or buy antiques from, and this was some sort of business transaction that went wrong. But they've never identified this guy, and for all we know, it could be mistaken eyewitness sightings. Maybe they saw Trevaline on a different occasion with a different man, or they saw a completely different woman, and this gray-haired man has no involvement at all. But I am inclined to think, though, that if the gray-haired man was responsible, then he was likely from out of town and was a complete stranger to the area, because otherwise, I think someone would have recognized him.
Yes, and I could see him. Maybe he was a con man. Maybe they were meeting within a few days, because and maybe because supposedly people that saw her thought she was at the wine bar with him, and so perhaps, but and in her situation, I'm sure she probably carried a lot of cash, being buying antiques as well as selling them, and this was 1990, so not a lot of debit cards. But I mean, she could have been, vulnerable because of that. Also because of her sign in the store that said, "I'll buy anything."
And also, if I recall correctly, there was a witness who thought they saw her at a grocery store earlier that morning before she disappeared and was certain that they had seen a wad of cash inside her purse. But when the purse was discovered inside her shop following her disappearance, there was no wad of cash in there. So if she was maybe planning to buy antiques from someone and use this cash to pay for them, she could have been conned and she could have been vulnerable, and perhaps someone decided to kill her and steal this money.
Yes, exactly. And that was in the Crime Watch UK segment because the lady kind of thought, well, you should hide your money better, but she didn't want to be rude and say anything to her. So that's why another theory is when I heard about this Christopher Hallowell, and that was just kind of brought forth in the last few years with that other documentary. But, he was a killer, but what caught my attention was he was arrested for antiques burglary, possibly in the 1980s. I'm not sure the exact year. And then he has this van, and then this carpet layer comes forward to say, "Yeah, I saw him in Llangollen the day before and the day of her disappearance." But the thing that caught my attention was one of the places he was parked was very close to the Addicts Antiques.
That is very interesting, and I have actually heard of the name Christopher Hallowell before because several years ago on the Trail When Cold, I did a episode about the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence, who went missing in England in 2009. I know that Hallowell has been linked to at least one or two murders, but they didn't take place until many years after Trevaline went missing.
Yeah.
Even though I believe he did have a few arrests under his record during the 1980s. And I think he would have been something like 26, 27 years old back in 1990. So it's certainly not impossible that he could have been responsible for Trevaline's disappearance. But he operated in England, and this is in Wales. So I don't really know if he had any ties to the area and would go there that often.
Yeah, and there's just one person that wanted to remain anonymous came forward, but I guess a scenario that crossed my mind was he has this van. He could have went into Attic Antiques and told Trevaline that he had some great things in his van, some antiques. That would be why she thought she was going to leave the shop for a minute, went with her money to go look, and he could have grabbed her and, pulled her in the van. That could be why she's never been seen after that that we
And
can
that would
verify.
And that would make sense because he was obviously not through the area, and if he was just passing through and nobody saw him with Trevaline, then he could have just killed her, disposed of her body, and never returned there. And that's why he's never been linked to the crime.
Yeah, because that's the craziest part that they could do this so quickly without anyone seeing a struggle. There was a spotty sighting of Trevaline in a vehicle leaving town, but of course you can't make much out of that.
Exactly. Unless someone was giving her a ride to see this so-called bungalow, I guess I could see her going somewhere in a vehicle and not taking her own car. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to be any logical reason for her to hitch a ride with someone when she had her own transportation.
Yes, and then one of the articles said that there was a couple in the shop, and like I said, this I only saw mention of this one time, but they claimed that they heard like voices raised in the back of the shop, and that was shortly before she put the sign out.
And that's kind of interesting. Like, did they interact directly with Trevaline, or did they just kind of walk in there and hear the voices, but then left without actually seeing her?
Yeah, I don't think they ever talked to her. And like I said, and it was hours before they even knew that Trevaline was missing because people just kept putting money through the slot of, she put some inexpensive items outside to sell. So they said that on this documentary, he said it was 10 hours before we even knew that she was missing.
Yeah, and that's always been interesting to me is that I guess this was such a trustworthy community that you could just leave items there and assume that
Yeah.
people were going to be honest and give you the money. But if she did that all the time, then I can understand why people did become overly suspicious when the store was closed. It had the back in 2 minutes sign on the door, and Trevaline was not seen.
Well, and as far as like I said, some of these articles, you'll see something mentioned once and you won't see it again. So you have to, realize it may not be accurate. But one of the articles had said that they thought that Trevaline was supposed to go pick her husband up that night, the 30 miles to Ridland. But another one said that her husband had, I guess, gotten a ride back into town and went to her shop and the back door was unlocked. But I only saw that mentioned one time.
Yeah, I find that so frustrating when I'm researching a lot of these cases is that you'll see these interesting details that get mentioned by one source, but you don't see them corroborated anywhere, so you wonder if they're accurate. And that was actually the first time I've even heard this
Yeah.
detail about the back door and her husband getting a ride. I mean, that could explain something that maybe Trevaline was abducted through the back door, and that's why no one saw anything, but we just don't know the accuracy of that information.
Yeah, and I do remember when I originally researched that the back door of the shop, I believe, was very close to the D River. But, they did search it, of course, soon after. I don't know if it had a fast current. I believe it had, it wasn't a very deep river or anything like that. So if she was in there, they probably would have located her.
I think so, and that's what's interesting is that even though this case is not particularly well known in North America, from what I've read, it was one of the most prominent missing persons cases in the history of Wales, which had a massive search effort. So it's not like the police did not do their due diligence; they really looked extensively for her. So I do agree that if she was in the river, they probably would have found her.
Yeah, what caught my attention was that the police went to literally every house in Llangollen.
Yeah, that was crazy to me.
Yeah,
I know that wouldn't fly here in the United States or Canada, but
yeah.
I guess in a small village like that where they're more trusting of the police, I guess they had no trouble letting them in to search their homes.
Mm. And another thing, now I'm a big fan of Crime Watch UK. I watch it all the time. But even, I mean, they were so successful back then when they aired, but even they said they really didn't get very many calls. I mean, it's just such a mysterious disappearance.
That is true. Yeah, I've watched quite a few episodes of Crime Watch when researching British
Yeah.
cold cases, and that is kind of surprising because this did get a lot of exposure, but that sounds like it was much fewer calls than average, which means that there was probably no one out there who had any hard information.
Yeah, and add that to the fact that she was so well known in that small town. I mean, so many people would have recognized her if they would have seen anything amiss. So, what do you make of the two plaques that were located years later?
Well, those kind of are so weird to me because to make a plaque where you actually have to carve in that message, that looks like it takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be one thing if it was an anonymous note that someone could have written out in a matter of minutes, but it just seems so eerie to me that someone would go to all that trouble just to scrawl that and then do it on two separate occasions. But even though they have denied it, I am inclined to believe that it was probably the brothers Andrew and Lee Sutton who made those plaques. And it might have been just bitterness because the police were not taking their lead seriously and they wanted to leave these things out there in order to get the case attention again.
Yeah, I 100% agree that it was Andy and Lee Sutton. I mean, who else? And they were annoyed that police didn't take their mysterious tip seriously, and maybe they thought this would get law enforcement's, attention.
Yeah, I was going through Reddit, looking through a couple of threads about this case, and
Mhm.
someone left a comment where they shared some additional information about Andy Sutton. And it does sound like he has a history of causing trouble because
Mm.
apparently in the early 2000s, he filed a lawsuit against the city council in Flatshire County alleging wrongful dismissal. It's a complicated story, but I think he received something like £100,000. But I kind of his credibility was lost on me when I heard him make a statement that he thought that the Freemasons were controlling the city council, and that's
Oh.
why they wanted to get rid of him because he was too honest and wanted to expose their misdeeds. And I'm like, yeah, he totally fits the profile of someone who would insert himself into a missing persons case for attention with bad information.
Yeah. And another thing I wondered too, because, they claim that she's buried under the Ridland Golf Club. Well, I believe one article said that their new vacation home was very close to the Ridland Golf Club. So I don't know if someone was trying to cast suspicion on her husband by throwing that out there. Of course, there's no validity, and they wouldn't even say who gave them this tip, which made it seem, even less credible.
Yeah, it's very suspicious because by I think it was 2019 when they came forward, and Richard had been dead for a couple years at that point, so it doesn't make much sense to try to cast suspicion on the husband again. And some of their allegations are pretty ridiculous, where they said that they saw signs of human remains down there, but by the time the police searched, there was nothing around. They found nothing. So the Suttons were believing that someone went to the trouble of removing the body from the golf course
Yeah.
before the police could search, which does not seem plausible to me at all. And they even tried to imply that there's some sort of police cover up, which doesn't make much sense either, since they put so much effort into the original investigation. And anyone working on that case back in 1990 was probably long retired by now. So, what reason would the current police force have to cover anything up?
Yeah, and you'll notice the plaques on the bench, they even talk about the day that her body was recovered from Ridland Golf Club, which definitely more points to them as well.
I have a feeling I've read this theory that they might have just had some sort of personal grudge against the golf club
Oh,
and
yeah.
just figured, well, we're going to try to say a body is there so that a police has to search, and this is going to cause them a lot of trouble. So it may be just some weird personal grudge they have against the club, and it has nothing to do with Trevaline's case.
Well, them injecting themselves into this disappearance, it almost reminds me of Judy Himes is alive and lives in Omaha. It's so random. They didn't even live in Langothlin. And then, what, 20 some years later, they're all of a sudden have this huge tip.
Yeah, exactly. I was surprised that that's a good comparison to the Judy Hyams case because we have all these tips of her supposedly being alive in Nebraska, even though she went missing in Florida 25 years earlier.
Yeah.
So you wonder what compelled this person to try to launch this hoax to get attention. And it's the same thing with the Suttons, where they have no known ties to the area. They don't even live there, don't have any known ties to the victim. Yet, many years after the fact, they bring the case back into the spotlight with a very weird story.
Yeah, and you know a little bit about him, but in my research, you couldn't find hardly anything about where these people came from, and they seem to have, not stayed in the headlines. I mean, maybe they wanted attention was one of the, reasons as well.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, I looked up the thing about his lawsuit against the city council, which was nearly 2 decades earlier. But it just gives off the impression that this whole family might be just a group of people who like to do anything they can to get attention and cause trouble.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say to sum everything up that I definitely think that she met with foul play. I think maybe the older man was, had some kind of plans, and he led her to believe they were working on a deal, and in the end, she was robbed and disposed of. Or, it could have been Christopher Hallowell. I mean, there's some things to, make you think twice, but ultimately I do think that she met with foul play. I certainly don't think it was suicide, or to start a new life.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I do not believe that her husband was involved. I think she just crossed paths with like a random stranger who did not live in the area, and this person just got very, very lucky and essentially committed the perfect crime that they were able to abduct her, likely take her out of the area, and dispose of her body without anyone seeing anything. But until we find any solid suspects, we may never know the motive. If this was someone who had a personal grudge against Trevaline, or if it could have just been a complete stranger who wanted to rob her, and then she was just an innocent victim who fell prey to someone who was manipulating her.
Yes, yes. Well, Robin, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Best of luck with your podcast, as it's very well done, and I listen every week. Thank you for being on my podcast today.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm so happy to see that you've started your own podcast because I love reading your articles at Lost and Found blogs. So it's great to hear them again in podcast form and also hear interviews with a lot of the people connected to these cases.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a true compliment from you. Okay, take care, Robin.
Bye. Thank you.
To wrap up my thoughts, this case just doesn't make any sense. The only somewhat plausible scenario I can come up with is that Trevaline left that afternoon with someone she knew or thought she knew and met with foul play after. That would explain why no one saw any abduction or any signs of a struggle at her house or her shop. Given her antique shop, she probably met and did business with strangers on a regular basis, and this could leave her vulnerable if she got into business with the wrong person. It is so strange to me that she had so many people see and even talk to her that day, and then she just abruptly vanishes with no other local sightings. Trevaline Evans was a highly thought of business owner, friend, wife, mother, and grandmother. Her case is one of the most bizarre I've came across. The police refer to it as the strangest case they have ever investigated. We can only hope that one day Trevaline's family that remains can get the answers they deserve. Hopefully, we can come to know whether that day Trevaline left for lunch or Liaison. That concludes the podcast on Trevaline Evans. A special thanks to Robin Werder for discussing this case with me. I also wanted to let you listeners know that I was a guest on the Unfound podcast last year, where Ed Denzel and I discussed this case. You can find it where you listen to your podcast, and there's also a video version of our chat on YouTube. That's under Unfound, Trevaline Evans' Little Shop of Mysteries. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. It is one word, Lost and Found Podcast. I post a new podcast every other Sunday, and as always, you can find all of my articles as well as links to my latest podcasts on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. And you can contact me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.